Welcome to Raise the Line with Osmosis from Elsevier, seeking solutions with leading experts on how to increase healthcare capacity so people can get the care they need during the pandemic and beyond.
Hi, I'm Shiv Gaglani. It's been called the worst disease you've never heard of, as coined by our guest today, Epidermolysis Bullosa, a rare genetic connective tissue disorder found in 1 out of every 20,000 births in the U.S. We're going to learn all about it today from Brett Kopelan, Executive Director of debra of America, the only national not-for-profit providing all-inclusive support to the EB community. More importantly, as he would tell you, he's also the father of Rafi, who was born with a severe form of recessive dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa, RDEB. Prior to his rare disease work, Brett was an accomplished entrepreneur, starting 3 companies raising more than $30 million in venture financing, where he led business development and marketing. He is also chair of the board of directors of the Foundation for Cell and Gene Medicine, is a member of the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, or ARM, and past chair of the board at the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Before we get started, I'd like to thank Elsevier CEO Kumsal Bayezid for recommending Brett for the podcast. Her daughter and Rafi were classmates together some years ago. And so, Brett, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thanks for having me, Shiv. It's a real pleasure to be here.
I obviously know a lot about your background, and Kumsal filled me in a bit. I would like to start, for our audience's sake, with, in your own words, telling us about you and your family's rare disease journey.
Sure. Patient journey, always a big thing to talk about, and especially in biotech and pharmaceuticals. I like to understand, the burden of living with a disease like this. So I was indoctrinated into the world of rare disease just about 15 years ago, back in November 2007, Upper West Side of Manhattan. My daughter was born. She was 2 weeks late. She was, really great, except she was missing skin bilaterally on both feet and on the back of one hand. And at that point, the official diagnosis was she was just overcooked. That was the official diagnosis by 2 physicians. So that's what I now call a total waste of $500,000 in education. But, about 6 hours later, while I was out somewhere on the West Side with some friends working on a hangover to celebrate the birth of our daughter, I got a call from my wife. I said, well, they just took her to the NICU, and I don't know why, and I'm kind of freaking out. And I said, I would not be so concerned at this point because she did have some open wounds on her feet and the back of her hand. They're probably concerned with the concept of infection in a newborn, so they just wanted to protect her. So the next morning, showed up early at the hospital. My wife and I went into the NICU. And the only way I can actually describe it was that the world fell out from underneath my feet at that point. I looked at my little baby girl. She had blisters all over her body. So generalized blistering, stuff that we hadn't seen popped up. They had no idea what was going on. And we were being told at that point that they weren't sure if she would ever leave the hospital if she made it through the next 24 hours. So that led to the next 10 days of trying to rule everything out. Every god-awful disorder that you could think of were tested for. And then we tended to we got lucky in that there happened to be a pediatric dermatologist who happened to be walking the floor of the NICU, who happened to hear them talk about blistering. So she said, well, I think it might be this. Let's test for it. So they did a punch biopsy, and they're called immunofluorescence, to see if there was a lack of protein. They do protein staining. It came back about a day later and saying it is indicative of recessive dystrophic Epidermolysis Bullosa, and let's just say EB going forward because it's a mouthful. So what that means is my daughter doesn't have the ability to produce collagen 7. So we've all heard of collagen. This is a specific type of collagen that is the building block of something called anchoring fibrils, which are what holds the 2 layers of skin together. So if you think about those 2 layers of skin as Velcro being held together by latches, she doesn't have the latch. Any of the latches, which are the anchoring fibrils. So any friction or trauma will create a blister or just a skin tear. Given the rules of New York and getting on Medicaid, that's when I first spoke to debra of America. Their nurse was incredibly helpful, telling me what we would need, what to expect, what our insurance needs would be, what wound care supplies we would look at. And so we spent the next 30 days in the NICU so that she would automatically qualify for Medicaid. Now, what I will say is the second we got that diagnosis, the first thing I did was ran to the phone, called my brother, who was a surgeon at that time. I said, Adam, they think it's something called Epidermolysis Bullosa. And he said, oh, four-letter word. Hung up the phone, ran to the nearest computer, and started Googling it. And I think we could all figure out that Google is not your friend at that point in time. So when I saw that she would have a very short life, that was really going to be about pain, disfigurement, incredibly painful disorder that is financially taxing, emotionally taxing, on top of physically, and that there was no treatment or cure, not even on the horizon at that point. So that's when I contacted Debra. They gave me all the information. And then shortly after we left the hospital, we went back to our apartment on the Upper West Side. The chairman of the board at that time said, given your background, would you be interested in joining the board of directors of debra? The formal title is the Dystrophic Epidermolysis Bullosa Research Association of America. That's a terrible email address, so we go by debra. And would you be interested in joining? And our first thought, talking to my wife about it, because, it is a commitment. And talking to my wife, we felt that we were lucky in that I was at that time choosing the insurance company, the insurance coverage for the company I was working at. We felt that we had more means than others, and knowing what this disorder does to people and how it attacks them physically, financially, emotionally, we felt we wanted to give back. So that was one aspect. The other aspect was I wanted to know every international researcher on the planet. And I wanted to know what was going on, if anything would be considered promising. Wanted to funnel money there. And should there ever be a clinical trial or more than one, we wanted to be in the top of the list at that point. So the strategy paid off. I should say I joined the board of directors in January of 2008. By the end of that year, my daughter was the 8th kid in the world to undergo a stem cell transplant in hopes to treat or cure. So we moved to Minneapolis, where she underwent the procedure at the University of Minnesota. 2 years later, came back to New York. I was a little disillusioned with the organization, was having financial difficulties. And I said, to my wife, we're going to go out and start a foundation and put them out of business. And she looked at me and said, don't be stupid. Take it all. It's got name cachet. It's got a board of directors. It's got money in the bank. Do something constructive with it. So in January 2011, I became the executive director. And at that time, there was no translational research. There was academic research, but nothing to be considered translational. And since then, we have our first product approved in the European Union now. We have our first gene therapy, what they call in vivo gene therapy, scheduled for approval in February of 2023. And we have 2 other gene therapies currently in phase 3 now. So there are multiple avenues being looked at. And I can say that I guess the past 2 years has really been the first time that I've said I'm working for my child's life, not for beyond her. So that's an exciting thing.
That's an incredible background and progress. I know, the rare disease parents and families and patients I've spoken to, it's never fast enough, but even given that time scale, things seem pretty amazing, the progress you and the team have made. Before we go into kind of more in depth on the policy stuff, which I know you're pretty expert at, what is, life like for Rafi and your family on a day-to-day basis these days?
Well, it's a difficult journey, more so for her than me. The best way I can start it off is, do you remember the last time you had a paper cut and you put Purell on it? That sting and that burn. Now imagine 60% of your body being an open wound and you just sat in a vat of Purell.
God.
That's what life is like on a daily basis. And then there are some good drugs, oxycodone, other stuff out there that don't quite take enough of the pain away. So you're looking at, anticipatory anxiety for bath and bandage changes, standard of care, which is every other day. These things can take 4 hours to undergo. Between removing all the bandages, doing the actual routine or the procedure, and then rebandaging. And that doesn't include setting up and cleaning up. So it is, in essence, a full-time job just in managing her care. She wakes up very early. I should say with EB and her type in particular, the only thing not affected are brains and lung. So her entire GI tract is affected from her mouth straight down to her buttocks. So going to the bathroom is incredibly painful. Eating is difficult. She has to have a surgery every 8 weeks to widen her throat. It's called an esophageal dilatation. They really just stick a balloon down there, pop open scar tissue, and then she's good for 7 weeks until, we need the next one. But life is challenging. She's in a wheelchair, but she goes to school and she has a group of friends. She hates when people say you're an inspiration because she's like, I'm just living. Everyone has issues. It's just a question of degrees. I don't know why I'm inspirational. She says, I don't know why I'm inspirational because, I wake up, I go to sleep, and I do everything in between. So she's pretty resilient. She's also a pretty special kid. She had a Make-A-Wish from the Make-A-Wish Foundation, an incredible organization. Most kids her age would want to see Selena Gomez, something like that. Her choice was Jane Goodall. So
that's awesome.
It really is. It was great. I think my wife and I got more out of it than my daughter or than Rafi did, but it was a great day. Our mornings start, I'll tell you what our journey looks like from a parental point of view. It started about 4:45 in the morning when we get up and start giving her the medications that she needs. Everything from growth hormones to pain medication to levothyroxine. She gets about 10 meds every morning. You got to space it out over time. She gets fed overnight through a G-tube and a pump, so it's easy for us to give medicine. Make the bandages, wake her up about 6:30 to get her to school by 9. So it's a long process. We change about half the bandages. Sleeping through the night is not a reality. So I haven't had a good night's sleep since maybe grad school. But, I guess your body gets used to it and you certainly live on a lot of coffee. But so it's a difficult slog. And the only thing that's really helped has been the hope for treatments, given the number of avenues. I know we'll get back into that, but now that something is really working very well, it's helping a lot. Hope has now turned into an expectation of a better life.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for breaking that down. I will say 2 touch points based on what you mentioned about Rafi. It's the Make-A-Wish Foundation. You know this because John Crowley, and we had him on the podcast. He was on the board of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, and now his daughter, it's really interesting. Her Make-A-Wish was going to Disney. Megan, she graduated with a Master's of Social Work recently from UNC after finishing up Notre Dame. She's now working at the Make-A-Wish Foundation.
That's great.
That's a more recent update. And the second is the Jane Goodall. I'm sure you have pictures, maybe even there's some footage of that. Would love to see it. So I'm talking to you right now. I'm in New York. I just got here because one of our other podcast guests was Chelsea Clinton. She and her dad have taken a good interest in rare diseases as well. She's involved with some rare disease groups. And so she's having this reception with the Clinton Global Initiative. It's about global health equity and a lot more than just one topic, but invited me over to talk to her a bit about rare disease work. David Fagenbaum, who you know from Chasing My Cure. And she and her mom just came out with this Apple TV series I recommend called Gutsy. And one of the episodes, they're with Jane Goodall. So there's all sorts of interesting connections. If I see her, I'll mention that to her.
Please. I'd love to talk equity and access with them. I mean, that's a huge topic when it comes to any disease, but rare disease in particular.
So let's get into that. I mean, obviously, you're in Boulder, Colorado. You moved from New York, largely because of insurance coverage. Maybe you can go into that, kind of talking about the policies and legislation you're working on to get guaranteed insurance coverage parity for those rare diseases.
Sure.
And then from there, move into some other policies that are currently being discussed.
Well, I'll tell you, the reason why we moved to Colorado, I run debra of America. I provide insurance, to my employees. And I think we can all say we hate insurance unless you absolutely need it, right? Well, a few years ago, Blue Cross Blue Shield raised our rates 100%. So it became expensive. But we were lucky we were able to get a plan with Aetna. Aetna then raised the plan 465%. So we went from $2,400 a month to insure a family to $11,500, and that's not affordable for the Clintons or like Microsoft, certainly not for a rare disease organization. So we knew that she had to be Medicaid dependent, and New York Medicaid is woefully insufficient. Wouldn't even pay for the bandages, which cost us about $100,000 a month. And there's only a handful of states that actually provide adequate coverage from a Medicaid perspective. Colorado has one of the best children's Medicaid out there for chronic disease. And they also have what I would arguably one of the best ED centers in the country. There's a handful of ED centers out there, and here in Colorado is really one of them. So it was an easy decision. Plus, I grew up skiing out here, and I always said in college, I want to live in Colorado. So one could almost say it's a dream come true. No, it was a great move. We used to fly to Cincinnati every 3 months for Cincinnati Children's for her care. Now we drive 40 minutes. So a huge difference in that. But in that, one of the things I knew that debra was missing early on when I became the executive director was a legislative side, right? Really, we didn't have much of a footprint on Capitol Hill or in the States. And clearly, from an insurance coverage point of view, from Medicaid coverage, we needed to ensure that our community was being adequately covered with insurance, which right now only about 33% of our population has adequate coverage. So, I mean, one of the things that debra does is give out free bandages. But when you're only looking at about 7 or 8 states that provide adequate coverage, it's really difficult. And not everybody is in the position that I am where I can move. I can leave my family and friends behind. My job follows me. So, we're, again, lucky. But so we started shaping a piece of legislation called the EB Care Act, which at that point would have guaranteed that genetic testing was done because most insurance companies don't consider it medically necessary. Many Medicaids don't. They consider it experimental. Clearly, genetic testing is not experimental. But if there's no treatment or no cure, it's not considered medically necessary to have a genetic test. And at that time, our genetic test was $3,400. And they are still, whole genome screening is expensive. Rapid genome screening is expensive. There's a whole exome. And then there's now something called panels as well, which can be $250. But it's important to get these things covered. So the EB Care Act would have guaranteed that insurance companies and Medicaids pay for the bandages, for any medication that is necessary, and out-of-state coverage, right? Because most clinical, no one really knows about epidermolysis bullosa. No one knows about EB. And there's only like 5 or 6 really good clinics out there that are associated with high school, and they're always cross state borders. So getting that paid for is also difficult. What we found at the time, we had bipartisan support, but doing anything in government is difficult. And what we found, one, we needed more data, right? Because we could say, hey, it costs $100,000 a month, it costs $10,000 a month to cover, and they said, show me the details. So actually, one of the things we're doing now is develop a burden of illness model, an economic burden of illness, looking at adjudicated insurance claims and building what does it actually cost, more than just my ad hoc analysis of 2 years of EOBs, explanation of benefits, which showed $1.3 million a year to take care of my daughter. So we need that from a policy perspective. And then there's another side. I do a lot of work with other rare disease organizations, Global Genes, RDLA. I used to work with NORD, Foundation for Cell and Gene Medicine, ARM. Strength in numbers, right? When you really want to get something passed, you need a tremendous number of co-sponsors on bills. And you need the Christmas tree bill to attach it to and all that kind of stuff, or an omnibus. And so when you have greater numbers, you're able to put something together that can make more sense. So one of the things we're working on is called EPIC RD. It is equity and parity in insurance coverage. It's making sure that Medicaids and Medicare will. There's a lot to it, so I don't want to go too deep into the woods because it's a deep, deep rabbit hole. But it would guarantee that if there is an FDA-approved medication for a rare disease, that Medicaids and Medicares would pay for it. That it would pay for durable medical equipment like wheelchairs, bandages, which is problematic with many insurance companies now. That appeals and prior authorizations would be streamlined. So it's very deep. And there are other pieces of legislation that are just as important. Precision Medicine Answers for Kids Today Act, right? Which guarantees that Medicaid will pay for genetic testing. Because I'll tell you, as someone that works with biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies, now they start asking, what is the specific mutation that is there, right? It's not just, it's a genetic mutation, because we're beyond small molecule drugs at this point, right? We're at base editing and, prime editing and read-throughs and exon skipping. So you need to know specifically what they are. So genetic testing is required. So in this particular bill, Medicaids will be required to pay for the genetic testing and mutation analysis when indicated. But more importantly, because it's taxpayer dollars, that you don't just go to the most expensive test that will give you the most information, but it is important to allow the geneticist or whoever is in charge of the case to choose which testing is which is most appropriate. So whether that's panels. So like these days with EB, you can just select, 10 genes to look at or 18 genes. So you can do a panel which could cost about $600, $700, maybe, depending on the number of genes you're looking at, as compared to $3,000-$4,000. And so there are a lot of there's the STAT Act. I mean, there's a new piece of legislation every other day.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's amazing. And hopefully this one gets passed, because one of our previous guests too is Philippe Pachter, who Kumsal, the Elsevier CEO, also introduced me to. And they had an issue of cross-border care when his daughter Lisiane was born in France, but the Center for Excellence for Pierre Robin sequence was in Germany.
Yeah.
And being able to get all of that and get it reimbursed by EU Commission, it still is a kind of a whole issue. And so similarly, like going from New York to Colorado and making sure that you're getting coverage through Medicare and Medicaid for these rare disease patients and families is critical. So that's the care. One thing we talked about before on our first call after Kumsal introduced us was, the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act is coming up in 2023, signed January 4th, 1983. That obviously was a massive piece of legislation. I know the person who helped write it. I'm curious, that's the first 40 years. How do we what kind of legislations are working, and or what do you think are you most excited about for the next 10 years to make sure that we create a lot more, so it isn't just palliative and care for Rafi, but like we're leading the treatments. I mean, you obviously have some good news on that front, hopefully in the next couple of years.
Look, the Orphan Drug Act is something you have to continue to protect, and it's an evolving piece of legislation. It's not in itself static. So one of the things that the Orphan Drug Act did was provide some incentives for drug development within rare disease, because if you have, say, 1,000 people that could be eligible for a treatment, what drug company in their right mind is going to go out there and develop for them? Right? It's not cost effective. So you're constantly making sure that those incentives stay intact. Great example is something called the Pediatric Rare Disease Priority Review Voucher. Right? And it gets set to what they call sunset, or go away every few years. But what this is, it's probably one of the most it's the most interesting and successful incentives out there. So let's say you're developing a drug for a rare disease, for EB, all right? And you get that drug approved. You have then applied for this review voucher. And if you are eligible for it and you get it, your next drug gets expedited review. So 6 months instead of 12 months, right? But the most important thing about it, and that in itself sounds great, but in rare disease, 6 months is nothing. You can wait that out, right? But it's a sellable asset. So a small single asset company can go to Pfizer, can go to Novartis, and sell that expedited review for their next blockbuster drug. And so when you're looking at hundreds of millions a month, right, then it's pretty significant. And the going rate right now is $110 million for that. And so you're able to recoup a lot of your research spend in that. So, a few years ago, it was set to expire. We did a lot of, myself and a few other people, did a lot of advocating on Capitol Hill. I wrote a piece for, Politico or something along those lines as well. And thankfully, Congress saw it our way, and it was extended. And then it was extended again now through, I think, 2024. So it's important to keep that going. And the other ones are PDUFA, right? Which is user fee laws. It basically funds the FDA. So before there was something called PDUFA, and we're on PDUFA 7 right now to give you a concept here. It's a way to fund the FDA. So now the FDA is not only funded by taxpayer dollars through Health and Human Services. Anytime a drug is approved, applied for, biotechnology and pharmaceuticals pay a license, a user fee, right? And that funds the FDA. But here's the more important part. Drugs used to take forever to get through the regulatory pathway, but because of PDUFA, that time has shrunk, to 6-7 months potentially. So it's incredibly important, and it's a must-pass piece of legislation that is right now being batted around, in government. But there's a continuing resolution, and now we're going to have an omnibus package, and it'll get, authorized in the omnibus for sure. Mostly because people that I work with are pounding pavement and the telephones to make sure that senators and congressmen vote for it.
That's incredible. It reminds me of how important it is to understand these details, because something we certainly don't learn in med school. And that actually brings me to a question I love to ask. Ultimately, Osmosis is a teaching company. We like to take complex things, whether it's EB or diabetes, and explain it in a very enjoyable, efficient, visual, obviously, manner.
Sure.
If you could snap your fingers and teach, any audience, be they the legislators, be they healthcare professionals, med students, researchers, whomever, the general public, any subject, like design a video or a course, you don't have to say it's in legislation, but I'm curious what it would be and to whom and why.
Well, from a med school perspective, know that while many of you may go into academia and academic research, know that you're going to come up with the science, but you're not necessarily the ones going to commercialize it. So, what you want to also understand is what they call the regulatory pathway, how to get your invention from the bench to the bedside, right? How to translate it through that whole progress. And the regulatory pathway is incredibly difficult, right? It's certainly much more than disproving the null and saying, oh my God, it works in a mouse model, because a lot of things don't translate from mouse model over. Understanding the regulatory pathway, and then being able to work with not only patient organizations, because it's most of the time the patient organizations that are funding the work that you're either doing or going to do, right? You want to get the patient perspective in drug development and even in early stage innovation, I guess, at this point. Because if you're interested in collagen 7, laminin 332, and this particular disorder, you want to engage with the patient organization, because what a clinical trial participant or a guinea pig, will endure, you don't understand, right? So you need to understand what, I've got this great small molecule, or I can do this editing, but they have to get 17 injections every day for 6 weeks. To an academic researcher, you may understand that it'd be difficult, but it's not going to stop your research, right? But there may be a better way to deliver the medicine. So engage in the patient population, right? Engage in the organization to find out what is clinically meaningful to them in this case, because that will guide some of your research in how you define a therapy over time. I think it's important. And always keep your eye down the road, right? Keep your eye on what, from a regulatory perspective, you need to do in order to do what you want to do in the early stages of thought to help people. Because you can come up with an innovation, but if you don't think 6 steps down the line, you got to play some chess, not checkers in this case, and you don't think 6 steps, it may never get to where it needs to be, into the patient's hands, into their body, and eventually help them. So it's really important to look down the line. And people like, me, and there are just some incredible rare disease leaders out there that they know the science in some cases better than the academic researcher, right? Pick up a phone, give a call, engage.
I love that. Those are all great pieces of advice, and you're clearly among them. I mean, you remind me a bit of a recent guest we also had on the podcast, Nick Sereau, whose both kids were born with a 1 in 500,000 condition called alkaptonuria, AKU. And like you, he got really involved in the AKU Society. Unfortunately, there is a therapy that's keeping his kids in very good health relative to where they were, or where other people with AKU could be. But he's also very involved in Beacon, which helps rare disease patient groups, and Orchard, which is doing OCD therapy, has funded 2 clinical trials on OCD that are starting. He has obsessive compulsive disorder. Similarly, when I read your bio, it's very impressive because debra, clearly why you're involved with debra, but you're also involved in launching several other nonprofits, helping other companies. I'd just love to hear just briefly from you about that pathway. Like, obviously you were involved in startups before and raised venture capital, et cetera. So you have that business development and marketing and organizational management expertise. But how do you pick the other things you're working on? And, what are you hoping to achieve with some of them? Maybe you can give us a punch list.
Sure. Well, look, what I will tell you is that, back in the days where I was raising venture capital was easier than doing it for a rare disease company. Let me tell you that, because you think about, charitable giving is always just a very, it's always the same percentage of GDP. Everybody in their household, each household has a certain percentage of their money they're going to give to charity, and they're going to give it to breast cancer. They're going to give it to, Susan G. Komen. They're going to give it to their grad school or their undergrad. And I have to go out and say, why my organization that's trying to help a disease that you've never heard of, that you'll probably never see in your life, why am I more deserving of your money? So it's actually a much more difficult raise for this. But as I said, I joined a lot of other larger advocacy organizations because some like Foundation for Cell and Gene Medicine, getting information out to patients and communities so that they understand what is being in a clinical trial. What should you be thinking about in going into a clinical trial? Now, I can tell you that before we jumped into that clinical trial that I mentioned earlier, the stem cell transplant, I think I spoke to almost every pediatric bone marrow transplanter in the country. I wanted to know what their thoughts were. I wasn't asking, do they think if this would work or anything like that. I wanted to understand what the potential pitfalls were. And what I learned from clinical trials in general is you can get better, you can stay the same, you can get worse, or you can die. Right? So those are your four options, and you have to be willing to accept each one of them. Not all clinical trials will say you're going to die, or that is not always one of them, one of the options, but you have to understand what the clinical trial is. So that kind of educational material, we've put together some shorts, some infographics discussing what you should talk to your physician about if you're considering going to clinical trial and stuff like that. Other organizations that I've been in from an advocating side is really developing policies that help drug development in general, right? Because the only way, it's really easy to demonize biotechnology and those medicines that charge too much. It's really easy, right? But in the end, you have to think they're the only ones that are going to help you in the long run. Right. So doesn't mean you should let them take advantage of you by any means, but, putting in policies, such like incentives for rare disease, like policies about consistencies across the regulatory pathway at the FDA, these things that support drug development, that make it more efficient and more timely, less costly in the long term means you will get help faster. So that's really why I started going, to some of these larger organizations, because that those policies that help biotechnology eventually help me, right? And they help my daughter, more importantly. So that's incredibly important. But as you mentioned, I'm also in the process right now of starting up another foundation through a venture capitalist that I know. I met this gentleman. I think we've all heard of BRCA mutations. It's mostly known within women, that if you do have this BRCA mutation, the first thing you do is either have a hysterectomy or, you can have radical mastectomies. It also affects males, right? So prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, he has a BRCA1 mutation, so he's had prostate cancer. He's very well off. So he has, committed to funding the beginning of this organization with $20 million to make a big difference in BRCA. Now, that could also lead to, because it's a rare disease. Now, here's another reason really to invest in rare disease research, because you are showing that certain platforms and certain ways of addressing diseases work, and you can do it in an expedited method. And then you can take that to more prevalent diseases like diabetes, like cardiovascular, like other type of wounds and stuff. So take advantage of the shorter road, right? And eventually it'll play out. But to do it's a very complicated pathway. So you can't ignore the legislative side. You can't ignore the academic side. You can't ignore the commercial side. You have to really have your hands in as many areas or fingers and pies, whatever you want to say, as you possibly can. Is another piece of that for those that ever start up a company. What I can tell you is hire for your weakness, not your strength.
Yeah. That's some really good advice. And again, very impressed with the depth and breadth of what you're doing. Hopefully this new nonprofit, wishing you the best on that launch and the impact I'm sure it'll have. We're coming up on time. So the last two questions I have for you, speaking of advice, you gave someone starting a company advice and hiring for their weakness. What advice would you give to our audience, primarily current and future healthcare professionals?
Well, my disease really has been in EB. It's really been under the dermatology umbrella, right, as the coordinators of care. And it's been in pediatric dermatology. And a lot of these rare diseases are pediatric in nature. And with more therapies coming down the road, we need more adult physicians in these rare diseases, because as an adult, you can't get treated in a child hospital, in a pediatric hospital, right? The adult physicians have to think about more things than pediatric physicians. So in EB's case, it's actually, we opened the one and only adult clinic in Philadelphia at Jefferson University. It is the only one in the country. So once you get past the age of 23, you don't have any specialists. So, and dermatologists generally get a bad rap, cosmetics and all that. It's fine. I have more respect for dermatologists than most other physicians, mostly because you just think about the number of things that manifest in the skin. Right? It's large organ, you name it. So I would say for those that are thinking about dermatology, pay attention to EB, because we now have, or we will have in the very near future, medicines and therapies that are going to extend lifespan beyond pediatrics. And it's going to be imperative that these people get taken care of as adults, not just in EB, but in rare diseases in general across the board. I think you'll find that they are generally coordinators of care, and those that have specialties in them are all pediatric. We need adult physicians for rare disease. And geneticists. Study your genes.
That's a novel piece of advice. We've never heard that in over 300 episodes. That's really interesting to know that there's a lack and need there. My last question, we could talk for hours, I'm sure, but is there any like major salient point you want to get across to our learners before we let you go for the day?
As you go through your stages of life, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. If you are parents now or you become parents, teach your kids inclusion. Okay? Rare diseases in general, EB in particular, but rare diseases in general are isolating. You will see a rare disease kid eating lunch at school by themselves. That's not right. That's not right. They're, in many cases, no different than any other kid. They love Harry Potter. Maybe it's friends and artwork. You'll find a lot of commonality, because in the end, they're just kids or they're just adults. Really not about bullying or anything like that. It's about inclusion, right? Don't be afraid to go up to that kid that looks different, right? Don't stare, ask questions. Don't be afraid. Because when I look back at my childhood and I ask myself, would I be inclusive? It's a very painful thing for me to say I wouldn't, right? I was your typical kid growing up in New York City in the suburbs of New Jersey, throwing footballs around and, playing video games and all that kind of stuff. And if there was a kid like Rafi in the lunch table, what would I have done? And it's a very painful, introspective, look at myself to say, and by the way, my first career was in clinical psychology. So, to look back and to say, I know that I wouldn't have been. So one of the most important things I can say is teach your kids to be inclusive. They will be better individuals for it in the long term. And that is the best way to help those that need help.
That's powerful. That's a very powerful lesson. And thank you for sharing that. Very much agree, especially in this age where there's so much focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's important, and we like to get this across to our audience, that inclusion also means disability, specific rare diseases. And that's one reason I think this area appeals so much to Osmosis and us, is because there's a great need. There's a need for education and awareness. There's so many out there. And our hope is, as a company dedicated to being approachable, one of our values is open your arms. We can help at least a subset of our audience think about it more, becoming more inclusive with the rare disease community. So, Brett, it's been an absolute pleasure getting to know you and having you on the podcast. I know, as I said, we could talk for hours, but I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. But more importantly, the work that you've done for Rafi, and obviously for many, many other people you probably will never meet.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here to let people know about EB, and really congratulations on Osmosis and Raise the Line.
Thanks so much. And with that, I'm Shiv Gaglani. Thank you to our audience for checking out today's show. And remember to do your part to raise the line and strengthen our healthcare system. We're all in this together. Take care.
If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes at osmosis.org/raisethelinepodcast.